Good evening, everyone. This week's Parsha is Parshas Beshalach, Tavshin Pei Aleph. I'd like to dedicate our learning in memory of my mother, Mrs. Shalamis Rabinowitz, Shalamis Basa Rabbi Yaakov Eliezer. So we will begin Perek Yud Daled Pasuk Yud. Uparo chapter 14, verse 10. Uparo Hikriv. The Jewish people had left Egypt, and Paro had a change of heart and was now going to chase the Jewish people to bring them back. Uparo Hikriv. Paro was approaching. Vayis'u b'nei Yisrael l'seinehem. The Jewish people lifted their eyes. V'hinei Mitzrayim noisea achareim. Behold, Egypt was traveling behind them. Vayiru ma'od. They became very fearful. Vayitz'aku b'nei Yisrael el Hashem. And the Jewish people cried out to Hashem. So on these last four words, actually more than four words, these last couple of words, Vayitz'aku b'nei Yisrael Hashem, the children of Israel cried out to Hashem. Rashi makes the following comment. Tafsu umanus avaisam. This crying out to God that the Jewish people did, what they were doing there was they were grabbing hold, tafsu, they took hold, umanus avaisam, of the craft of their forefathers. Crying out to God was the Jewish people taking hold of the craft of their forefathers. And Rashi then cites a number of places where we see that Abraham prayed, Yitzchak prayed, Yaakov prayed. So therefore, this crying out to Hashem, says Rashi, was the Jewish people following in the footsteps of their forefathers, and using a very interesting way of describing that by saying they took hold of the craft of their ancestors. Now, every time you read a comment of Rashi, you have to figure out what's Rashi coming to do. Rashi doesn't just come and tell us interesting little tidbits. Rashi is coming to explain something in the verse. There's something bothering Rashi, something that needs some kind of interpretation here, that Rashi brings this in. Because if it was just because there's a nice medrash in the Mechilta that says when they cried here that they took hold of the craft of their ancestors, Rashi wouldn't say it unless you need it in order to explain something that's going on here. So it's very interesting that some of the commentaries on Rashi say that Rashi is bringing this in as a critique of the Jewish people. Why is that? Because right after the next verse, I have it in front of me on the computer in front of me. After this verse where it says, and Paro approached, and the Jewish people cried out to Hashem, that's verse 10. Pasuk Yudal, verse 11 reads, Vayoimru, and the Jewish people said, El Moshe to Moshe, Mitzrayim, are there no graves in Egypt? That you took us to die in the desert? What is this that you've done to us that you've taken us out from Egypt? This is what he said to you in Mitzrayim, in Egypt, saying, leave us alone, and we'll serve Egypt. Better that we serve the Egyptians than die in the desert. So there's something very funny going on here. First, we have in Pasuk Yud, verse 10, the Jewish people crying out to God. And in the very next verse, they're complaining to Moshe about leaving Egypt. So what's going on here? Are they crying out to God? Are they doing something good? If they're doing something good, what all of a sudden happens in the very next verse that they're complaining, which is clearly not something virtuous on their part? So therefore, there are commentaries that say that actually Rashi is coming to answer this problem. Were they doing, if we know in the next verse they're complaining, which is not something good on their part, what's exactly going on here when they're crying out to Hashem? Says Rashi, according to some commentaries, Rashi's intent is to say that, no, this crying out to Hashem was not something praiseworthy on their part. You know what it was? It was habit. It was something they saw by their forefathers. You know, sometimes a person says, why do you do this? This is what my father did. Why? You have no idea. You really care? Not really, but my father did it, so I did it. The Jewish people, when they cried out to Hashem, it wasn't genuine. It was just habit. It was just doing what they saw by their ancestors. And therefore, the fact that they complained right afterwards is not a contradiction. It's not difficult to understand. The first crying out to Hashem was kind of rote. It was just habit. They saw they knew from their ancestors, what do you do when you have a need? You daven to Hashem. Okay, that's what they did. But it wasn't genuine, and therefore the next verse that talks about their complaining fits in just fine. So according to this, Rashi, who says these words, the Jewish people took hold of the craft of their father, according to them, Rashi's just saying they did it by habit. And that's why the next pasuk is not a contradiction that they complained the very next second. Very interesting. And when you read this Rashi, they took hold of the craft of their fathers. Sounds good. But they're saying no, they took hold of the craft. Whatever their fathers did, and they had a tradition, that's what their fathers did, that's what they did. But it wasn't real, it wasn't sincere, and therefore the next thing they can do was complain. That's how some commentaries explain it. There is a sefer called Das Torah on the Chumash that is from the classes given on the Parsha from Rabbi Rucham Levovitz. Rucham Levovitz was one of the heads of the yeshiva of Mir, yeshiva of Mir in Poland, pre-World War II. One of the greatest yeshivas of the Lithuanian yeshivas before World War II. Rabbi Rucham Levovitz was known as the Mashkiach, and again, he was one of the rabbis, not the main rabbi there in the yeshiva in many ways, and he is the great-grandfather of my wife. And Rabbi Rucham Levovitz, he explained Rashi differently. He explained Rashi not in a critique form, but rather in a praiseworthy form. And he too is bothered by what exactly is Rashi coming to tell us here. What's Rashi trying to tell us here about this crying out to Hashem? He says they cried out to Hashem. What more is Rashi adding to that by saying they took hold of the craft of their ancestors? So he gives the following explanation, and he starts with a very interesting little story. He says that he remembers when there was a fire in the town of Mir. And, it wasn't that long ago in our country, too, that if a fire broke out, it meant the place was going to burn down. And when this fire broke out in Mir, it devastated the community. And there were these firefighters, local, from around the area that all came to try to put out the fire. But not much was able to be done. So Rucham says that in the middle of all this, in the middle of the whole tumult, there was a Jew who had completely abandoned Judaism. His father seemingly was a religious Jew. He abandoned all observance. All observance. It happened before World War II also in European cities. He had no more connection to Yiddishkeit, no more connection to Jewish religion. And this man, in the middle of the whole tumult made the following comment. I'm going to say it in English. He said, if only the Rabbeinu Shalom, if only the Master of the Universe would send his firefighters, would send his firemen, if only he would send down a torrent of rain from heaven. That's what he said. That is what this Jew had abandoned Judaism, abandoned everything. He didn't believe in anything. This was his reaction. If only, halavai, if only that the Rabbeinu Shalom, that Hashem should send his firemen, his firefighters. Halavai, Hashem should send down rain. So Yerucham said he was shocked. He was shocked that he should respond this way. But really, what this showed is that when a Jew finds himself, up against the wall, there's nowhere to turn, there's nowhere to go, no help seems to be on the way, there seems to be no hope. At that point, something what was ingrained from him, from his father, woke up. In this situation, he becomes a Jew like his father. That's what happens by a Jew. When a Jew finds himself pressed against the wall, there's no hope, he has nowhere to turn, that's when he goes back to what he saw by his father. That's when he goes back to being Jewish like his father. And that, says Rabbi Yerucham, is what is happening here when Rashi says, and Rashi is quoting a medrash from the Mechilta, which is a medrash, that the point here is two. Even the point is that in a Uben Yisrael, the Eis Dachkai, when a Jew finds himself in a precarious situation, a situation where he has nowhere to turn, he turns his eyes to his Father in heaven. That's when he takes hold of the craft of his forefathers. At the end of the day, their craft is his craft. And in a time of distress, that's when it comes back. And that's what he says. That's Rashi's point. That after they saw what was going on, Paro was approaching, and they became so frightened. What was their reaction? The reaction is, go back to what you have ingrained in you from your ancestors. Go back to what's ingrained in you from Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. They were daveners. They're people who turned to Hashem. That was part of their upbringing. That was part of who they were. And when a Jew finds himself in distress, it's that part of his ancestors, that's part of him, that's ingrained in him, that awakens and comes out. That's what's happening to the Jewish people. And he points out the fact that Rashi called a medrash, again, I'm saying Rashi quoting a medrash, the fact that the wording is they took hold of the craft of their ancestors. A craft means something. That's how you operate. That's what you operate with. Your craft is how you live. It's how you do everything. That's how you operate. The way that the Avraham and Yaakov operated, that was with tefillah, with prayer. And they took hold of that craft. Just as their fathers took hold of that craft, they did the same thing. And they did it, and that was their automatic reaction. Their automatic reaction in the sense of how does a Jew react in this kind of situation? He reacts in this kind of situation of going back to the craft of his ancestors, prayer, which is something that is part of his essence because it comes from his ancestors. And that's what happened here. They were in trouble. What was their reaction? To do what they had ingrained in them from their forefathers. And it doesn't sound, from the way Rucham explaining it, that this is a critique. On the contrary, he's really trying to say that deep down, every Jew, deep down, he has within him the craft of his ancestors, turning to Hashem. As Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov did. And when does that come out? When he's in trouble. When he's in trouble, has nowhere to turn, that's when it comes out. And that's what's happening here. What was the reaction to being fearful? By Yitzaku, they cried out. Why was that the automatic reaction? Why was that the reaction to them? Why was that the reaction that came out of that fear? Because they were taking hold of the craft of what was part of their essence of turning to Hashem in need, which they inherited, which was ingrained in them from Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. So that is how Rabbi Yerucham explains what Rashi's trying to do here. Rashi's trying to say they didn't just daven. When it says they cried out, it wasn't just davening. There was something more going on. It was they were grabbing hold of the craft of their forefathers, and that is why their reaction under stress was crying out to Hashem, because that is how a Jew reacts under stress. Okay, that's his explanation. Now, so it's a very interesting concept. It's a concept that if we don't see it on ourselves, then it means that we're not connected to our essence the way we should be. But it comes out, and it can come out even in the person who seems the furthest away from everything, like that story that Rabbi Yerucham told of. Somebody the furthest away. But when he's in trouble, it comes out. What's ingrained from him, what's part of his essence that he had from his fathers, that comes out. And the way Rucham is saying it comes out for real. Now, I'd like to share with you the following little thought I had here about this. A little question. There's a saying that goes, there are no atheists in a foxhole. It's a famous comment, which means when you're in a foxhole, the bullets are flying over your head, you got nowhere to go, there's no hope, no one's an atheist then. At that point, everybody is praying to God. So if that statement is true, then then this idea that Rabbi Yerucham is saying, he's making it something uniquely Jewish. That's what he's doing. He's trying to say this is what we have from Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. But according to that saying, anybody would react that way. Anybody would react that way. So, what's uniquely Jewish to all this? Or what's the basis to say it's uniquely Jewish? So I'd like to suggest the following. Let's go back to the story. Okay. So then you have this person, non-believer, the city's burning down, and there's only one thing that could help, rain. And he says, if only if only God would send his firefighters. Okay, so Yerucham is saying, in a time of distress, he's becoming like his father. And I'm saying, maybe not. He's just atheist in a foxhole. I was thinking the following. The atheist in the foxhole, he really has nothing else. He doesn't have anything else. He doesn't have it. He only has God. Even though if he's an atheist, it comes out what's really inside of him. This guy in the mirror, he had a solution. It's called rain. And he could have very well said, I wish it would rain. When I hear about the big fires that go on in California, right? So what do you think about, if it would just rain? That's I'll be honest with you, that's how I think. It would be great if it would rain, right? In the news, they talk about, is rain coming? Is not rain coming? No one's talking about Hashem. We're just talking about rain, nature. This non-believer could have just said, I wish it would rain, because there is a solution. Again, it's not a solution within our hands, but there's a solution. It's nature's solution. And he could have well just said, I wish it would rain. He didn't say that. He said, Halavai, if only the Eibishter, if only God would send his firefighters. That's deeper than the atheist. He was talking about Hashem. And looking at the Jewish people in their situation, right? Rashi says they were following the craft of Rabbi Yitzchak and Yaakov. I don't know, maybe they're just atheists in a foxhole. So to that I would say, is that the Torah says, Vayis'aku el Hashem, they cried out to Hashem. And according to Rabbi Yerucham, it's real, it's genuine. It's genuine. It's something inside of them that is awakened, that gets awakened in the time of distress. I would argue, I've never been in a foxhole, but it's possible, I would make an argument, suggestion rather, that the atheist in the foxhole says, oh God, help me. I don't know how deep a prayer it is. It's a reaction. He's stuck. I'll turn to God. I'm stuck. I'll turn to God. He does. But it's not deep. It's not that sincere. It's a reaction. It's a desperation. It's an act of desperation. In the sense of the Jewish people, in the case of the Jewish people, the Torah says they cried out to Hashem. If the Torah says they cried out to Hashem, that means they cried out to Hashem. They really cried out to Hashem. That shows us it's more than the atheist in the foxhole. It's a real prayer from the depths of their heart. And therefore, what's happening here is uniquely Jewish. Because what's happening here is happening, it's real, it's deep, it's coming from the heart. And that is what happens to it. That is what should be happening. If a Jew is truly in touch with his essence, and sometimes we get in touch in the right essence in the most unexpected way, as that Jew in Poland in the mirror by the fire did. But the essence, our reaction, our innate reaction, the reaction that we have automatic within us, that was part of our craft. It was the craft of our ancestors, and therefore our craft too is at a time of distress, we turn to Hashem. Now, I need to add something else here. And that is that okay? So Rabbi Yochanan says that Rashi, with this medrash, is trying to tell us that there was this, not just telling us they davened, but what was happening here was this, how a Jew reacts in a time of distress. But what does that help us in the psukim, right? We said before, Rashi is coming to explain something that was bothering him. He's trying to explain something in the verse, right? According to what we're saying now, Rashi is telling us, he's explaining something in the sense that you should know what this Vayezaku is. But he didn't need that, seemingly, to explain something in the verse itself. It would sound like the verse tells us that they cried out, and Rashi's adding something to this. You should know that this crying out has a deeper explanation to it. But it's not something that he needed because something was bothering him here in the verses. And that's typically what Rashi's doing. So perhaps we could say the following. So, I'm sure many of you are familiar with the Art Scroll Chumash. Art Scroll has a couple of Chumashim. One set of the 5 books of the Torah that Art Scroll has is the Rashi Chumash, where they focus on Rashi line by line. It's an elucidation of Rashi line, a translation, explanation of Rashi line by line with footnotes. And in one of the footnotes there on this Rashi, they cite a commentary called Devek Tov, which is a commentary on Rashi. And they bring the following comment from the Devek Tov. And I quote, in the next verse, the children of Israel are complaining to Moshe about their perilous situation. Their cry to God in this verse, however, is not a complaint, but a prayer. Meaning, the Devek Tov is saying, what is Rashi coming to do here? Rashi is coming to also address what was bothering the commentaries mentioned in the beginning. Here we have a pasuk that says they cried out to Hashem. The next pasuk they complained to Moshe. So it seems a bit contradiction, like they're going from one extreme to the other extreme. So the Devek Tov says, I just want to let you know that although in the next verse they're complaining, when this verse says they cried out to God, don't explain it means they cried out to God complaining, God, what are you doing to us? No, they're praying. In the verse they're praying. The next verse they're complaining, but in this verse they're praying. That's what Devek Tov says. Devek Tov says Rashi is coming to tell you in this verse, this is not a complaint. This crying out to God is not complaining to God. This verse is prayer. In this verse, they took hold of the craft of their forefathers. Now, I still think, now we have to kind of fit in. So this addition that Baruch gives us, as to read now, meaning the following. All right, Rashi wants to tell us they davened. They weren't complaining, they were davening. So that's what Rashi has to tell us. Rashi can just tell us, don't think this crying is complaining. It's davening. Why does Rashi have to call it they took hold of the craft of their forefathers? Does Rashi have to do that for? So perhaps, so Yerucham is trying to explain, what is Rashi using this description for, but how does it fit into what we're trying to do here with explaining the whole Rashi? So perhaps we could say, maybe one way of saying it is that once Rashi has to say that, explain that they're davening here, he decides to throw in this line, this medrash, for an addition, to give us more depth into understanding what this crying was about. Rashi doesn't need it for what he's coming to do. Rashi's main purpose is to tell us what this crying out is. It's not complaining, it's praying. Once he's doing that, he adds the medrash to give it a little bit more flavor, to give it some more depth. Perhaps we could say another thing, and that is that although we're learning now, according to the Devek Tov, that Rashi wants to tell us this verse is prayer. The next verse is complaining, but the previous verse, crying out to Hashem, is not complaining, it's praying. It's still kind of troubling that there is this big switch from one to the other, from crying out to Hashem to complaining. Therefore, Rashi is somewhat doing what the previous commentaries did. He's not saying it's rote. It's not rote. It's a real reaction that comes from within because it's what we have from our forefathers. But because it is something that does come from within, it's not something that comes like with a lot of contemplation beforehand. It does kind of come automatic. As real as it is, since it's automatic, although it's real, but it's automatic, somewhat automatic, let's call it. Again, it's not just rote, it's real. But it's coming out automatically. Therefore, it's possible shortly afterwards to be complaining. If we're talking about that they're going through this whole contemplation, and with that they go ahead and daven to Hashem, then it's harder to go from that to complaining. But if this is something from within that comes out, as real as it may be, it's still something that is not as deep that would now prevent them from complaining afterwards. So perhaps that's how we can put this whole thing together. If we follow the Devik Tov, Rashi is coming to explain that although in the next pasuk they're complaining, this crying out to Hashem is not complaining, it's praying. Rashi now gives us some more of a interesting, gives us a deeper description of davening in a special way, taking a hold of the craft of their ancestors. The meaning of that, says Yerucham, is it's something innate within them from their forefathers that comes out in a time of distress. The point to bring that in here is to help us understand that although this is a prayer that's going on, being that, again, it was something that happened somewhat automatic, therefore it was possible that shortly, that right after that, they could turn to complain to Moshe. The two opposite end reactions don't have to be so contradictory. If the first one, as positive as it is automatic, not rote, just something that comes out on its own, and because that's how it comes out, to then switch over to complaining isn't as hard to accept, to comprehend. Perhaps that's explanation. Have a wonderful night. Be well.